Expresses a desire to see overall wages go up, but fears harm toward those with lowest skills. As a compromise, she proposes a smart minimum wage. That's what she calls it, a smart minimum wage, one that would avoid a one-size-fits-all approach and go up according to educational skill and attainment. For example, if a high school dropout earned their GED, their minimum wage would go up. Is this the kind of compromise that you could support, Ben Shapiro?
No, because that's called the free market. Meaning that if you have better qualifications, then you will get paid more. It's why I went to Harvard Law School, so I get paid more than somebody who didn't go to Harvard Law School. I mean, that's just the way that the world works. The problem that we see in this entire debate, unfortunately, is that what we have on the one side is a recognition that people, and maybe we blame God, maybe we blame cosmic circumstance for this, some people are better qualified for jobs than other people. And so then the question becomes, is it the role of government to implement cosmic justice? Is it the role of government to come in and even all playing fields? That there's some people, look, I'm a 5'9", 150 Jewish guy. I'm never going to play ball like Kobe Bryant. And it's something that makes me sad. Is it the role for government to come in and mandate that I make the same amount of money? I mean, this is as a general question, this is the problem. Conservatives are sort of stuck in between a rock and a hard place on this particular proposal. Because congratulations to Councilmember Sawant, this has tremendous momentum. This $15 minimum wage has tremendous momentum. So you're seeing people come out and try to come up with compromise solutions. Should we come up with a graduated scale? Should we come up with something in between? Should we come up with something that we gradually implement, as the mayor has suggested? And the answer, I believe, from conservatives is no. If we are going to have this debate, and if we are going to lose, then let's see how the policy plays out. And let's see if it plays out. If it plays out just as Councilmember Sawant has suggested, then maybe we'll all be happy and we'll go home happy at the end of the day. And if it doesn't, then maybe some people will get wise to how the economy actually works.
What is up, everybody? Welcome back to the Freedom Fighter Show, and today we're going to be talking about minimum wage. So to start off the discussion, it's important to understand one of the basic fundamentals of economics, that is supply and demand. Like any other product, labor has a price that is fluctuated by supply and demand. Supply and demand states that as a good's price rises, the demand for it decreases. So what is a wage exactly? It's a price on labor. So wages are set by the supply of workers that can be in a given field and the demand for that job. If there's an abundance of potential workers, that means supply will be high and demand will be low, meaning an employer can pay them a lower wage because there'll be more people willing to accept the lower prevailing wage. Whereas a field like mechanical engineering will have far less potential workers because those skills are more scarce and difficult to acquire, meaning employers have to pay them more to really entice them to work for their company. A minimum wage breaks the relationship that an employer and an employee has with negotiating their wage, meaning that anybody who wants to work at a certain wage may not be able to if it's below the arbitrarily set minimum that the government has put out. So basically, if somebody wanted to work for, let's say, $5 an hour, that would get them by, they'd be fine with that, and they're like, I will take your job, just give me $5 an hour, I need the job. The employer has to say, sorry, no can do, because it's too low, it's below the minimum, so no job for you. And I see that as being more of a problem than them being paid a lower wage. Clearly, if they were willing to accept it, then it's a voluntary transaction, they were good to go, and it should have just been it, they should have gotten the job. So why is it that so many politicians and social advocates are out there fighting for a living wage of $15 an hour? Mostly because it's just politically popular at the moment. No credible economists support minimum wage laws because they're just arbitrary price floors for the costs of labor, and all that does is cause unemployment, and the data overwhelmingly shows this. Most people who have a grasp of minimum wage will tell you that the real minimum wage will always be zero because people won't have a job at all. So who do these price floors hurt the most? Well, that would be the young, unskilled, and uneducated workers. So the first set of data I'd like to point out was a study done by the great economist Thomas Sowell in his book Basic Economics, and he talks about how minimum wage laws disproportionately affects especially minority, young, unskilled workers. In the book, Sowell says, before federal minimum wage laws were instituted in the 1930s, the black unemployment rate was slightly lower than the white unemployment rate in 1930, but then followed the Davis-Bacon Act of 1931, the National Industrial Recovery Act of 1933, and the Fair Labor Standard Act of 1938, all of which imposed government-mandated minimum wages either on a particular sector or more broadly. By 1954, black unemployment rates were double those of whites and have continued to be at that level or higher. Those particularly hard hit by the resulting unemployment have been black teenage males. He goes on to say in the book that early unionization during those times were particularly racist because they were trying to keep blacks out of the labor market. Black people at the time would be moving into these jobs, and they would accept jobs at slightly lower wages than the white people were willing to work, and they did the jobs just fine. So white people would start their unions and set these arbitrary minimum wages, claiming that it would be fair for the workers, but all it did was price the black people who had less education at the time out of the market. And this only goes to show that it's the same thing today, because black teen unemployment is at about 50%. The first job a person gets is often the most important one. It gets them into the career field, and you can possibly move up from there once you start. So by setting the price at a level that people can't even enter, it makes it impossible for people to get their first job and potentially move up later on in their lives. The other massive effect minimum wage laws has is on small businesses. You know, when people have these fights for minimum wage and raising the minimum wage, it usually comes up in relation to big corporations like a McDonald's or a Walmart, which obviously have the kinds of profits that can take in the increased labor costs of raising minimum wages. But what often goes unnoticed are the small businesses that may have to fail out and go bankrupt because they can't pay their employees that much. An article by The Guardian pointed out this exact problem. They talked to many small business owners, and while some of them thought a minimum wage raise would be a decent idea, most of them disagreed and said it would hurt their businesses profoundly. One business owner said this: "At this point, as a startup, it would put me out of business. It would also hurt my employees. Right now, my workers are all high school kids who are cutting their teeth on their first job. If the minimum wage went to $15, I would have to hire someone with management experience, which would take the kids out of the running." And that was just one of the many examples that they cited in the article. You can read the whole thing. I'll put the link in the description box. So really, would helping some workers at Walmart or McDonald's make a few extra bucks really be worth crippling so many small businesses that run our economy? I don't think so. Now, I know what you're saying. Hey, I keep up with the minimum wage fight. I know that cities like Seattle, who have raised their minimum wages, are doing just fine in the job market. Well, not exactly. A study done by the University of Washington recently found that the minimum wage increase so far in the short term has not led to any significant benefits for low-skilled workers. They show that the gains made by some employees who have gotten raises because of the increase in the minimum wage has simply been offset by the amount of people who have been either fired or cut back their hours because they couldn't be paid that much for so long. Another thing they had to factor in was the fact that Seattle's job market was growing anyway before the minimum wage increase, meaning the jobs that they were getting were already jobs that were not at minimum wage level. They were over it. A quote from the study says, "Even amid a relative boom, Seattle's lowest wage earners show signs of lagging behind a control group drawn from other parts of the state. The employment rate was down 1 percentage point for workers who earned less than $11 an hour in mid-2014. Their average hours declined, and the proportion switched from jobs in the city to elsewhere ticked up by 2 or 3%. They also go on to say that this is simply a short-term effect of the minimum wage law. So long-term effects we're yet to see, but most economists predict that in the long term, they have even more disastrous effects on the labor market. Walter Williams, another renowned economist, had this simple question to ask people who advocate for higher minimum wage. Is it likely that an employer would find it in his interest to pay a worker $15 an hour when the worker has skills that enable him to produce only $5 worth of value an hour to the employer's output? Unlike my fellow economists who might argue to the contrary, I would say that most employers would view hiring such a worker as a losing economic proposition, but they might hire him at $5 an hour. This is as simple as it gets. People need jobs, and people are willing to work for a certain amount. You can't possibly expect to set a price of labor at an arbitrary amount and expect that everybody is going to be able to meet that standard. By forcing employers to pay people more than they are worth, they are simply going to find people who are worth that amount of money. The people who need these jobs the most, the poor people, the people who are unskilled, don't have as much education, these are the people that need these jobs the most, and you are setting them out of the market by trying to feel good about yourself by raising the minimum wage to a certain amount that you deem acceptable. And economics is a funny thing. A lot of economists disagree on a lot of different issues. There rarely is consensus on every single issue. However, minimum wage causing unemployment is one of the things that most economists agree on, about 70% actually. So why is it so difficult for so many people to grasp that this is simply a bad policy? The answer, like most government policies to combat poverty, is that it feels good. A living wage seems like such a great thing to advocate for, right? You want everybody to have the same amount of money so that they can purchase everything that they need, all their necessities, food, healthcare, whatnot. But the problem is that this doesn't cut it. There's a flaw in the logic, and it's that the people in the United States aren't poor because they're not being paid enough. They're poor because they're not working. According to the US Census Bureau, only 2% of full-time workers in the United States are poor. 94% of people in poverty in the United States are not working full-time. 77% are not working at all. And this is only backed up by other studies done in other countries. For example, Switzerland, which has no federally mandated minimum wage, has an unemployment of only 4%. Whereas Spain, which has one of the highest minimum wages in the world, has an unemployment rate of 22%. And you can make these comparisons with other countries all day long. Denmark is in a similar situation, no federally mandated minimum wage, super low unemployment. Greece, incredibly high minimum wage, incredibly high unemployment. And another thing that people don't factor in is that when labor costs go up, those costs are simply passed on to consumers. So everything that people need that are working on these living wages is going to be more expensive for them. So it's going to offset their raise anyways. When their housing becomes more expensive, when the food becomes more expensive, when their medical bills become more expensive, these are all products of a minimum wage being raised and costs being passed on to consumers. This also creates a raise in inflation, which means your money is worth less anyways. And one study by the Sovereign Investor points to this. They say, no matter how I slice the data though, the 1 and 2 year inflation rates topped the rate in the year prior to the wage increase in nearly every instance, which implies that some correlation clearly exists between the two, that on some level, minimum wage increases are a leading indicator of unexpectedly higher inflation in the offing. So even though people have more technical dollars in their pocket, it's actually not going as far. It's why while nominal wages increase, the actual value of their wages decreases because you can't buy as much with that money. And finally, we get to the point that if raising minimum wage has no bad effects, then why $15? Why not $20? Why not $50? Why not $10,000 an hour for minimum wage? It has no effect, right? It should be just fine. It just comes out of the company's wallets, right? The reason nobody wants to acknowledge this is because they know at some point it fails. It's a bad policy, it doesn't work. They just hope that they can squeak it by just enough so that you don't notice how bad it is immediately, and that you'll keep voting for them when they promise you these things. But if you really feel like you want to help these workers, the people who need these jobs the most, then you would understand that a higher minimum wage would simply hurt them because they wouldn't be able to get any job at all. Supply and demand, like gravity, is one law that politicians and social advocates simply can't change on a whim because they want to. But that's it for this video, guys. If you have any questions or comments, please put them below. Until next time, see ya.
Since you provided no data in that actual answer, it's not that difficult. As far as the notion that workers embrace a $15 minimum wage, the real question was, and this is the real question, who knows better what should be the result of a consensual bargain between two parties? Somebody who's completely unrelated to that bargain, or either of the parties, or the two parties who are involved. When an employer and an employee decide to make a consensual relationship together, I mean, it's incredible that the minimum wage debate actually reverses itself when it comes to gay marriage. But when it comes to, or same-sex relationships in so many cases, the concept being that consent is of the highest value for many members of the left, except when it comes to economic relationships, at which point it goes completely out the window. At that point, then government gets to step in whenever it pleases because people know better than anybody else how a business should be run. So this really becomes the question is, why not? And really, this is the key question, I think, maybe of the entire night. Why, at what point is economic inequality solved? Why not just pay everybody the same amount, regardless of the job that they do, and we can have the government nationalize all business in order to accomplish this? Why not just do that? That would be economic equality at its finest. Otherwise, you are sanctioning economic inequality of some level or another.